This week we will be looking at engaging with the world, and in particular, engaging the world with compassion. Now, just a few little details. This message has nothing to do with Star Trek, except when I think of the word engage, I think of Captain Jean-Luc Picard always saying engage. And so that's why he's up there. So if you're not a Star Trek fan, don't worry about it. Second, we will get to a screen with a blue-footed booby on it, which is a little animal with literally blue feet. Again, that has nothing to do with the message whatsoever, except I liked the picture when it came up in the presentation, so I just left the picture there. So don't be distracted by it, but I'm hoping that every time you see a blue-footed booby, you think about engaging with God and engaging with the world. If that was the Pavlovian response I was aiming for, I probably should have picked something more common like a gas station or a field or something, so you actually think about this often. But yeah, so those are the two little notes that I wanted to throw out there. How many of you have ever had an experience sort of similar to this? I was at Red Lobster, working at Red Lobster back when Tara and I were first married. And at the end of my shift one night, I don't remember, 11, midnight, something like that, I came out of the restaurant and there was a woman there who was in tears and asking for help. I don't remember the exact details of whether we went into the restaurant, made phone calls or not, or all of those details. But what I do remember is that somehow she was here, they were just visiting in Calgary. Her boyfriend had taken off, or significant other, husband, I don't remember, and had left her in the parking lot at Red Lobster by herself late at night with no money and no recourses, no connections in town. And I remember her telling me this story. I don't remember if she was, perhaps a little bit drunk or high. I don't remember. I remember she was very, very distraught. And I'm sitting there, this 21-year-old kid, trying to go, what do I do? How do I help? Do I believe her? Do I not believe her? Is she just pulling one over on me? What exactly is going on? I'm sure many of you understand that. What do I do? And so I finally ended up taking her over to an Econo Lodge, which was sort of right behind the restaurant, and paid for $40 or something like that for a one-night stay at the hotel at the Econo Lodge because she had nowhere else to go. And then I went home. And I think I called Tara before I paid for that, but either way, I did it. And went home, and I remember lying there in bed that night going, what if she trashes the room? What if she was lying to me? Now they've got my credit card, and if there's any damage to the room, I'm responsible for it. And I came back the next day, and everything was fine. She had slept there. She had left. No idea who she is, where she is, what happened to her. Never saw her again. Don't expect to ever see her again. But one of those awkward moments where you're presented with a difficult situation, and you go, what do I do? Living in Costa Rica, we had another but much more prolonged situation. There was a guy who would come by our house, and in Costa Rica, you had your house and you had your garage area, and it was like you were living in a fortress. It was really crazy living in Costa Rica because there was just a lot of crime, a lot of problems, and so the houses were like fortresses. And so at the end of your garage, you didn't just have a gate, but it was like a full gate. You could not get out if you wanted to, and in fact, we had a number of people who at times would get locked in the middle of their garage because you needed a key to get in the house and you needed a different key to get out of the garage or into the garage, and people would lose one and shut the garage door or whatever door, and suddenly they're like, oh, I'm stuck. I can't get in my house and I can't get out of the garage. So that's amusing. But he would come, and I'd be sitting in the living room, and we'd often leave the door open because it was quiet and it was all gated so nobody could get in. And all of a sudden I'd hear this, Chris, and I'd be like, oh. There's a guy named Juan Pablo, and he would come by all the time, looking for help, looking for a little bit of money, wanting some clothes, wanting some other stuff. He had some sort of drug or alcohol issues. He was always fine when he came by, but he was always asking for help, always asking for stuff. Went with him one time to visit his mom who lived nearby, and she's like, if you can help him, that'd be great, and trying to tease out and understand his story and figure out how do I help him and not just be this rich guy, which I'm not rich, but you feel it in those countries, throwing money at him. And we finally me and another guy arranged to get him into a rehab center because he said he had these problems. Well, it lasted less than a week, and he was back at our door calling for me, and I was like, really? And I don't know that we ever accomplished anything of value with him. But what do you do? What do you do when you're faced with situations of difficulty and situations where you're going, how do I respond to this? How do I help? What do I need to do? I remember even that as a pastor, whether it was here or in Manville, people would show up, and the only people who show up needing help are the people who have the really bad luck, hard stories. And it's one of those things where you're kind of listening to their story going, I don't know if I believe you or not, but the only people, it's one of those crazy stories or situations where you're trying to make a decision of whether to help somebody because their story sounds terrible, but you're going, you could be lying. And you know that a lot of people were lying about their story. But then there were also people who really were hurt and struggling who would show up, and they'd have the same story, but it was true for them. And it was so hard to figure out who do you help, who really needs help, who doesn't. And you can have this tendency to become a little bit jaded, a little bit frustrated, a little bit skeptical, to say the least. But we live in a world where we're surrounded by difficulties, where we're surrounded by hurts, where we're surrounded by people who are struggling. And how do we cope with that? How do we deal with that? As Christians, and as we look at God's word, I think our overarching concern is that we are called to respond with compassion. If we look at the person of Jesus, just look at a few verses tied in with Jesus. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And so we see Jesus entering the multitudes and healing and touching people and helping them, driving out demons. Why? Because they just needed help. Because there was so much hurt and so much difficulty that he had compassion on them. If we look at the beginning of his ministry, right when he's first starting out and he's in one of the temples and they ask him to read and he grabs this, it says, "And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, 'The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor.'" So in speaking about his mission, and then he sits down and says, "This has been fulfilled in your sight." In other words, this is what I have come to do. But look at what he's talking about there. The poor, the captives, the blind, the oppressed. And this is who Jesus says he came to minister. This is what he came to do. Or another famous story, the parable of the sheep and the goats. Matthew 25, right at the very end. And again, these people are brought and separated into two different groups. And what's the difference? The difference is how they responded to the hungry, to the thirsty, to the stranger, to the naked, to the sick, to those in prison. Doesn't take very long looking at the life of Jesus to see that he was a person filled with love, filled with compassion, a person who came to help those who were in deep need. In fact, I went through and I looked at the book of Mark, and I went through, and according to the headings, there were about 43 different headings in the time leading up to Jesus' final week. You could probably cut that down a little bit because some of the parables he told were all in a group, and so it would be pretty easy to cut that down to about 40 different interactions that he had with people in different settings in the book of Mark. Of those, 19 relate to healing and touching and driving out demons and showing compassion. So virtually half of them. And then there are another couple in there where it's more of a teaching time, like where he welcomes the little children where it's pretty obvious that there's this love and this compassion being shown. Or the rich young ruler, where it's more a teaching about wealth and its effects on us. But it says Jesus looked at him and was filled with love, and he loved him, and then he called him to take his money and to give it away to the poor. So even though that one is a teaching, it's pretty heavy-laced with compassion and a call to show compassion. And so looking at that, half of Jesus' ministry, half was teaching or these other interactions he had, and half is just stories of him showing love and helping people and touching people in their place of need. And so we can't really say that Jesus' ministry was only about that, but we sure can't take it away from Jesus' ministry. What would be left if we took all of those stories out? Some nice teachings, but the teachings don't go very far without the person of Jesus and the actions of Jesus and all of the stuff that he was doing. And so we cannot separate this concept of compassion from Jesus, this concept of love and practically stepping out and helping people, because it is who Jesus was. It wasn't just about doing ministry. It was about this is the character and the person of Jesus. A person who is overflowing with compassion and love. And so you listen to all of his teachings because of what you see in the person of Jesus and what he did. The church figured that out. Because you look at the book of Acts, and pretty quick you begin to see a very similar pattern. You see them preaching and people accepting Christ. And then immediately we see in chapter 2, chapter 4, that they were gathering together. And that as there were needs, people would sell property or give away things to help meet these needs and to take care of one another, to love and to help those who were experiencing difficulties. We even see one of the first big things, we do see some miracles and whatnot as well, but we see one of the most interesting, Acts chapter 5, with Ananias and Sapphira and how they are struck down. And what's the whole problem? The whole problem was that they lied about how generous they were being. They sold something and gave some of the money and then claimed they had given it all. And that is what got them struck down by God, was that they tried to pretend they were more generous than they were. And it was sort of like, no, if you're going to be generous, but don't pretend that you're being generous. And of course, the distribution of food to the widows, that was obviously part of their practice, because there was a whole complaint and discussion that arose about that, and they had to resolve that and figure out how to take care of these widows. But it was just sort of assumed, of course, we are going to help those in need. And so there is this incredible sense of compassion and love flowing from Christ. Now, in many ways, I know that I am preaching to the choir. I have been here as part of the congregation for a number of years, and I know that we are not perfect. I am not, you are not. But I have seen an incredible compassion and generosity and love for people around us. I have seen that in many of you and from many of you. I've talked with you and heard about stories. I've seen how you have stepped in, supported the food bank in different areas and different things that we have done, individuals who have needed help, and I know that there have been many stories. So please don't hear me saying this as you're all bad and you need to do better, or you're terrible at this and why can't you learn? But what did come to mind is something that Paul said in his letter to the First Thessalonians. That's what they were called, the First Thessalonians. To the church in Thessalonica, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 1, where he says, "As for other matters, brothers and sisters, we instructed you how to live in order to please God, as in fact you are living. Now we ask you and urge you in Lord Jesus to do this more and more." So hear this message in that light. Not that you are not already doing it, but as a reminder, as a call for all of us as Christians to do so more and more. So I just wanted to put that out there. I should have had that picture up earlier, but oh well. We know about Jesus and his compassion and love. We know the early church was called to that. So how do we engage this world with compassion? Because that's what we are called to do. I think the first thing that we need to get into our mind is as we engage the world, we lead with compassion. Now, I don't mean that we are leaders and that because we are leaders, we should have compassion. Basically, what I mean by that is that compassion comes first. Sort of like playing a deck of cards. What are you going to lead? What is the first thing, or playing a game of cards, sorry. What is the first thing you start with? I'm going to turn that away. I'm getting some feedback or something, and I don't know if turning that away will make a difference. But we are called to lead with compassion, to go first with compassion, because that is what really will get people's attention. How many of you know what a springboard is? It's that little thing set in front of the vault that gymnasts use. And they run up, they jump on the springboard, and it gives them some extra momentum, some extra height, some extra movement so that they can do the flips and the jumps and everything else that they want to do. And the springboard is really kind of a crucial element because it really helps you to get that extra bit that you need to get where you're going to go. If they didn't have a springboard, they'd be running up and jumping on their own power, and it would be okay, but the springboard multiplies their own force and their own effort. Well, what goes wrong, or what happens when the springboard doesn't do his job properly? So I've just got a short video here. No volume. And now in slow-mo for those who missed it. The springboard is a rather crucial element to the gymnast being able to do what they want to do. Now, he was okay. I just want to say that. He even qualified after this to get on the Olympic team, so he was okay. He did fine. But the springboard is sort of something that multiplies your effort, but if we don't use it at all, it leads to a complete failure, or it can. And I think that it's really helpful to view this ministry of compassion, A, as part of who we are, just as it was part of Jesus and who he was, but B, as sort of the springboard that really allows us to do what God has called us to do. As I said, what would Jesus' ministry have looked like if he was just walking around talking to people and never loving, never helping, never showing compassion? People listened to him and paid attention to what he was saying because of the love that they felt from him, because of the fact that he was willing to enter into their difficulty and to show them love, to grant them grace, whether they deserved it or not. And in the same way, as we minister, we become far more effective in reaching to this world if we use compassion as a springboard to multiply the words and the truth that we have. Next week, we'll talk about engaging the world with truth. But we lead with compassion. Because you've probably seen it, and I've seen it, where somebody comes in blasting with truth and telling people the truth and letting them know exactly what God's word says. And it turns out pretty much like this. It's like running full speed into a vaulting horse or whatever they call that thing. It doesn't work very well. It doesn't accomplish much. The beautiful pirouettes and twists and turns that you're expecting to see as somebody responds to the gospel don't happen because not many people like getting blown up with the truth. And so we are called to lead with compassion, because that is the way people will know we care, and that is the way that people are actually willing to listen to us. So we lead with compassion. Second thing is that there are a lot of obstacles to showing compassion to people. It is not easy to love people. I don't know how many of you have ever noticed that. It can be pretty easy most days, hopefully, to love your spouse. If you're not too tired, it can be easy to love your kids. But if you're tired and they're disobeying, it's not so easy anymore. And the further people get away from you in terms of actual blood connections, generally speaking, the more difficult it gets, unless you find a kindred spirit who agrees with you on absolutely everything, and then it's easy because it's basically you're just interacting with yourself in another body. So, you can't even really say that you're interacting with people. You're just, another version of you. But it's hard to love people. There are a lot of obstacles to doing this well. There's our own selfishness. Just in general, we want to think about ourselves first. And it's just generally pretty hard to think about other people because we are consumed by ourselves and our own needs and our own day-to-day life. And there's no way to get away from that. I mean, we have to pay the mortgage, we have to go to work, we've got responsibilities, and we've got other things. And so that is part of the life that God has given us, and we're not to be angry or to discount that or to try to run away from our life. I'm not giving anyone permission to run away from your life. But it sure can distract us from doing anything compassionate for other people. But within that, we can look at various categories. We like being comfortable. And to help people, to show compassion to them, infringes on our own comfort. I don't know how many times when Juan Pablo came by, I was sitting watching TV or doing something I enjoyed, and he came by, Chris, and I'm like, oh. Why? Because I was comfortable. I was happy doing what I was doing. I did not want to go to the door and have another long conversation with him and figure out how much money I could give him or not give him this time. And, it's hard. Because when we are called to show compassion to people, it means probably we're going to have to sacrifice a little bit of our own comfort. And we don't like that. It's hard because we live in a society, in a culture where it's all about our rights. And the really funny thing I find is that this whole idea of human rights really comes from a very Christian perspective. We are all made in the image of God, and therefore we all have rights as children of God. We shouldn't be, like where this really started coming by was the new colonialists coming into the new world and stealing all this land from the natives and mistreating them. And it was done in the name of the church, which is terrible, but it was also countered in the name of the church where they said, no, these people are human and they have rights. We should not be taking their land from them. We should not be robbing from them. We should not be treating them just as slaves. They have an inherent right as humans made in the image of God to have all of this stuff. And so the whole idea of human rights was really birthed out of a Christian context, out of this idea that humans are made in God's image. But now fast forward however many hundreds of years, and it's become a selfish thing. And so often we think about our rights instead of thinking about the other person. And so we become very selfish, and it's hard to show compassion to other people when you're thinking all about yourself and your rights and how somebody else is infringing on your rights. And so on that, I would simply say, perhaps we view it as we fight for the rights of other people, and as Christians, we are willing to sacrifice our own rights for the sake of the gospel. Or, it's my life. Anybody heard that phrase? Bon Jovi has a famous song that always runs through my mind. It's my life. And he just goes on. It's this great rock ballad, but it's sort of like, wow, that's very wonderful. But that attitude. It's my life. And even when it comes to God and when we're Christians, and C.S. Lewis writes about this, is we have this idea that, I can give God his due, his little bit that he deserves. I can go to church, I can help out here, I can do a little bit here, and whatever's left I get to keep for mine. It's my life. And C.S. Lewis comes back and he says, it's not really. You were bought with a price. Your whole life is God's. We don't approach God like the tax collector where we give him his little bit and then the rest is ours. Our entire life belongs to Christ. That's pretty hard to wrap your head around. And it makes it pretty hard to show compassion to others when we're sitting there going, it's mine, it's mine, it's mine, it's mine, it's mine. I'll give you a little bit, but the rest is mine. What about simply the obstacle of fear? I had this with that lady that I mentioned at the beginning. Taking her over, it's late at night. I'm going, is she going to trash the room? Is she going to, what's she going to do? Is she setting me up for something? That would have been really easy to distract me. And on many occasions, that type of fear has kept me from helping people. Or even Juan Pablo, I remember going with him when I went to see his mom, and we're walking through these streets that I'm unfamiliar with, and I don't know what's around, and I'm like, is he just leading me into a trap to rob me because he knows that I'm a rich guy? Boy, it would have been easy to turn around and go back. And so we can easily allow fear of whatever it is, our own personal safety or fear of people taking advantage of us. And so many different things can keep us from showing compassion. What about the culture? Believe it or not, our culture can cause this problem. How many were brought up with the idea of you work hard and you make your own way in life? Does that ever distract you from showing compassion to other people? You ever feel like you look at them and go, why are you being so lazy? Why aren't you doing more? Why aren't you out there getting a job? There's a lot of great stuff about that particular part of our culture, and there would be any number of other things you could look at that have their good side, but their shadow side is, rather than being compassionate, sometimes we end up being really judgmental towards other people. Or the truth, I already mentioned this one. We love us some truth in the church. Truth is important. But boy, can we use it as a sledgehammer sometimes. And when we lead with truth instead of leading with compassion, truth can often do far more damage than it does good. Jesus spoke the truth. There's no doubt about that. You look at the things that he taught, the challenges that he issued to people, the way that he told them to live. He was all about truth. He didn't pull any punches. But it was so overwhelmed by the compassion that people were willing to listen to the truth because they could see what they wanted and they realized that, oh, maybe he's worth listening to. And so as great as the truth is, it can actually be a pretty big obstacle sometimes to us showing compassion. That's especially true when we're talking about big social issues. I don't know how many of you have ever noticed this. When you're talking about politics or you're talking about biblical stuff, we can come down pretty hard, but it can really come across as a lack of compassion. Whether that issue is racial stuff that has been in the news lately, whether it's the homosexual, transgender discussion, whether it's immigration, whether it's homelessness and poverty and drugs and all of these other things. We certainly have a truth to speak to that. But so often we get caught up talking about the truth and what's right and what should happen that the compassion disappears. In different churches as we visited and as I just interact with people, I have heard countless discussions about all of these issues. They're almost always focused on the truth and what's right or wrong. And this is in churches. I almost never have been part of a conversation where we're discussing how do we love these people? How do we help them in their need. And I know that many of us do. I know that many Christians are very, very generous and very helping and very loving. And yet when you sit down and you listen to the conversation, you would never guess that. Just something to think about. Another big one is simply lack of intentionality. And this is the last obstacle I'll mention. I feel like in my own life, and I feel like I see this as I talk with people too, there's a lot of compassion that can come up in emergency situations or in just spur of the moment. Somebody comes up and they need help, and okay, we'll respond to that in the moment and we can help. But some of the issues around us that this world is facing need a lot more than just our occasional interaction. I think Jesus was pretty intentional in showing compassion to people. I think that he was very deliberate about putting himself in positions where he needed to show love to people and just offering himself willingly. And that's something that becomes an obstacle in our life. When an issue comes up where we need to be compassionate to people, we can perhaps interact with that, and we can do that very well. But we might go weeks or months without any of those situations coming up. And in the meantime, are we really engaging with the world? Or are we just sitting back waiting for one of those emergency situations? This is where we jump back to the selfishness or the comfort issue. It's also where we jump back to one of the great challenges, which is simply time. And we'll get to that in just a moment. But if we're going to engage the world with compassion, at least some of it has to be intentional compassion. Intentionally seeking out the opportunities and saying, what are the needs? I had meant to, and I really am frustrated that I didn't do it, to just go talk to the town and go talk to FCSS and say, what are the needs in our community? What is actually happening? Where are people struggling? Whether it's marriages or families or so many different things. I mean, talk about the whole COVID-19. How many people are in desperate need of compassion or help because of how this has impacted them? Parents as they get ready to send their kids back to school or in the schools or so many different areas, finances, domestic problems. I don't know, but I know that there's just as many problems now as there were in the time of Jesus. Might not be able to go around and just magically heal people or heal people in the way that Jesus did. But how do we deliberately engage the world with compassion? I don't remember where I need to point. There we go. And so we talked about we need to lead with compassion. Talked about some of the obstacles. Just want to throw a few different cautions in there briefly. How many know this guy? Or at least who this actor is representing? The first caution is this: you aren't him. Do not develop a savior complex. You are not called to save the world and to save every single person from every single situation. In fact, you can't. You will get absolutely overwhelmed even trying. And so we have to keep that in mind. We are not the Savior. It is not our responsibility to solve every person's problems or even to solve any one individual's problems. But that does not mean that we are called to not engage. It just means that balance is crucial. We engage intentionally and deliberately. We attempt to, like Jesus, allow compassion to seep out of our very pores so that it is such a part of who we are that everybody around us sees Everybody around us sees and feels that compassion and knows of our deep love. But at the same time, we do have other responsibilities. We do have to go to work. Now, we can show lots of compassion for people at work and enter into their lives and love and care for them. We do have other responsibilities. We do have other people. We can't ignore our family to try to be helpful to other people. We minister with compassion within our family. We've got limited finances. We can't spend all of our money to solve all of the world's problems. We are called to love our family and to take care of things. We don't have inexhaustible stores of energy. We are called to take a Sabbath, to take a day, a time of rest. But none of that means that we stop deliberately engaging with compassion. And the final one, hey, you remember this phrase? Together is better. We need other people around us because a lot of problems are too big and too difficult. A lot of times we need wisdom. A lot of times we just need accountability. People to look us in the eye and say, hey, you're sounding like you're veering awful far this way. How about we move you back towards compassion and try to help you do that? Or to say, you're getting way too involved in this situation and you need to step back. You are not the Savior and you need to let this one go. And so we need to live this life of compassion together rather than trying to do it all ourselves. So those are just a few cautions that I want to mention. Lead with compassion. There are obstacles, there are cautions. But in the end, we are called to engage with this world and to engage this world with compassion. And so I would just ask, what does that look like? I'd ask you to take just a moment and think, what is one of the obstacles that is getting in the way of me showing compassion to people? Is it an obsession with the truth? Is it just that I've got a little too comfortable? That I'm tempted to be a little too selfish in my day-to-day life? Are there things in the culture? Am I controlled by fear? What is it that keeps me from allowing that compassion to soar and to seep through me into the life of others? I don't have to solve everything, but think of one thing. What is one of the obstacles in your life? And the second thing would just be the flip side of that. What are the opportunities that God is putting before you or that you need to seek out to show compassion to the world around you? Do you need to be like me and make a trip to the FCSS or one of the organizations and say, hey, what is happening here? Where do people have need? Do you need to actually say, well, I know of this organization or that organization and it's always interested me, so maybe I go help with them? You know, some of you might remember Ron and Lois at Palm Ministry Centers welcoming newcomers and immigrants to Canada. They're always willing to take volunteers. That would be one simple example. I know Dawn works with the food bank. Talk to Dawn. Do they need more help at the food bank? Are there other things going on in the community? Are there other opportunities where as Christians we can actually engage the world with compassion? Because if we don't, we're going to end up like that gymnast, sprawled on the ground, proclaiming truth for all the world to hear, with everybody just sort of walking by and looking sadly at us.